The dark road seemed endless, the ambulance's headlights cutting through the darkness, but what appeared to be a normal journey would soon turn into a nightmare. Marcos, the driver, felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders as he tried to maintain control of the vehicle, transporting a wounded CJNG commander, unaware that an ambush awaited ahead. The cartel had eyes everywhere, and they didn't know that the ambulance carried much more than a wounded man. It carried a key to dismantling their entire operation. But what they didn't know was that this night would change everyone's destiny. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss the next stories full of suspense and excitement. Let's discover together what happens next. The sun had barely set, and the dirt road that snaked through the outskirts of Guadalajara was already deserted. The crickets, once solitary, now joined the chorus of the strong wind, raising small clouds of dust. Inside the ambulance, the only sounds were the intermittent beep of the heart monitor and the heavy sigh of the driver, Marcos, trying to remain calm. Beside her, Nurse Mariana stared intently at what remained of the police commander, who lay unconscious, covered in a blanket of blood and bearing wounds from a seemingly endless shootout. Her hand trembled as she checked the patient's vital signs. The commander, a middle-aged man, was in critical condition, but still breathing despite the severity of his injuries. Marcos and Mariana knew the risk was imminent. The ambulance, once discreet, now drew attention in the middle of that deserted road. They were aware that an unexpected change could happen at any moment. After all, what they didn't know, but the universe around them certainly did, was that the CJNG, one of the most powerful cartels in Mexico, was searching for something far more precious that day. On the ambulance radio, the hoarse voice of a police officer accompanying them reassured them, but the tension was palpable. They had been fleeing a war, but now they were the ones being hunted. The commander, unconscious and bleeding, represented something far greater than a simple wounded officer. Inside that battered body lay the information that the CJNG feared most, and which, unknowingly, was now drawing ever closer. Marcos ran a hand over his sweaty face and, in his mind, thought about the imminent escape. It couldn't be clearer. That road, that ambulance, those precious minutes could mean life or death. But no one there imagined the true magnitude of the threat that was about to close in on them. And the truth was more terrifying than they could have imagined. The ambush had already begun. The dirt road seemed endless, a fragile line stretching between nothingness and utter silence. Only the dust, the chirping of crickets, and the occasional static of a radio broke the void. The region around Guadalajara, known for its small villages and vast agave plantations, had over the years transformed into a silent battlefield. The territory, a land divided between military forces, the police, and the growing power of drug trafficking, was never the same again. The CJNG, with its calculated violence and network of influence, was everywhere. Marcos, the ambulance driver, knew this all too well. He had grown up in a poor neighborhood of the city and had seen firsthand how the streets had been transformed by the shadows of the cartel. He had always been cautious, keeping a low profile, never getting directly involved in any part of this dirty war. But when the wounded commander was placed in the ambulance, his life became intertwined with the fate of that night. He knew that by transporting such an important officer, he too would become a target. Mariana, on the other hand, was a younger, idealistic and somewhat impulsive nurse. She still believed that by saving lives, she could change the course of the war and the injustices plaguing the country. But what she didn't know was that her decision to save that commander would bring an even greater risk to both of them. She didn't know the details of the operation he was involved in, but she had already heard rumors that his capture or death would mean a mortal blow to the cartel. The commander lying on the stretcher was in critical condition. His eyes were closed and his breathing irregular, signs that he wouldn't survive much longer. but there was something about him that seemed to defy expectations. He was known for being ruthless in the fight against drug trafficking, and that didn't go unnoticed. His presence, though silent, weighed heavily on the air. If he died, it could mean the end of one of the few remaining hopes for combating the growing power of the cartels. Mexico, in its essence, was a land of contrasts. On one hand, the beauty of its mountains, deserts, and ancient cities like Guadalajara represented the vibrant and resilient culture of its people. On the other, the grim reality of the drug war permeated everything, from politics to daily life. Every road, every city, every village had a story of struggle, of survival. However, that night, the story of Marcos, Mariana, and the commander would be yet another to add to the long tale of violence and resistance that the country faced. The tension in the air was palpable. Marcos looked at Mariana, who was focused on monitoring the commander's condition. They knew the net was closing in, but what they didn't yet understand was that, in that ambulance, they weren't just transporting a wounded man. They were carrying the future of an even crueler war. The dust on the road now seemed like a heavy blanket, covering everything. With each passing kilometer, the fear grew, as if the desert winds were carrying something more than just hot, dry air. Marcos gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to focus on the road ahead, but the feeling that they were being watched wouldn't go away. He knew something was wrong. The road was strangely empty, and the radio, once full of chaotic conversations about transportation, was now silent, as if the world had stopped around them. Mariana, who until that moment had been focused on trying to stabilize the commander, turned to Marcos with a tense expression. "What's happening, Marcos? What are you feeling?" Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a dark intuition that was beginning to take hold of her mind. "I don't know. I just feel like we're being watched," Marcos replied, his voice low, almost as if he feared someone might hear him. "Something's not right." Suddenly, the radio crackled with the voice of the police officer accompanying them. "We see cars approaching. We don't know who they are. Get ready." Panic grew like a wave. Marcos floored the accelerator, trying to gain distance, but the sound of heavy engines soon became audible. It came from afar, but was approaching rapidly. Marcos didn't know if it was the military or what remained of the police still patrolling those areas, but a terrifying thought crossed his mind. What if it was them, the CJNG? At that moment, the tension wasn't just in the air, but inside the ambulance itself. The commander, who had been motionless until then, let out a weak groan. Mariana hurried to adjust the IV and check his blood pressure again, but her eyes were fixed on the road ahead. She knew that if this was a cartel ambush, the chances of survival were minimal. The headlights of a car appeared around the bend, and Marcos recognized the sound of tires screeching on the dirt. He didn't have time to wait and see who it was. He needed to react. He looked at Mariana, his expression as desperate as hers. He had to choose: accelerate and try to escape, or try to defend himself from an imminent encirclement. Fear tightened his throat as he made the decision. "Hold on!" he yelled, and floored the gas pedal with all his might. But it didn't take long to realize that the road, which had previously seemed empty, was now crowded. Dark cars with tinted windows blocked the exit. There was no escape. The ambulance was surrounded. "They know who we're transporting, Marcos," Mariana whispered, looking out the window. She saw the armed men approaching, moving with the precision of a military operation. It wasn't just any ambush. It was a trap, and the wounded commander had something the CJNG wanted more than any drugs or money. Marcos looked at the commander, feeling a mixture of anger and despair. How were they going to deal with this situation? The radio remained silent, but inside the ambulance, the sound of the commander's heavy breathing seemed deafening. "Mariana, we need to run away." But there was nowhere else to go. The men began to approach. Marcos knew that in a short time the doors would be broken down and they would be faced with an impossible choice: hand over the commander or fight to the end. Inside the ambulance, the air was heavy. The silence, broken only by the sound of the engines and the tense breathing of the occupants, seemed to increase the pressure. Mariana and Marcos knew they didn't have much time. The CJNG, known for their brutality and strategic skill, didn't give their enemies many chances, and the wounded commander, who had not yet shown signs of recovery, was a valuable prize for them. Outside, the situation was equally tense. Cartel cars surrounded the ambulance, and every move seemed calculated to ensure none of the occupants escaped. In one of the cars, the leader of the CJNG operation, known only as El Loco, watched the scene intently. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke louder than any speech. El Loco had no interest in arguing. His mission was simple: capture or eliminate the commander, either way. But what he didn't know, what neither he nor his men could foresee, was that the operation was about to change drastically. El Loco was a man of extreme loyalty to the cartel, but even he knew that loyalty isn't something one maintains without a plausible justification. The story behind his motivation wasn't just financial. El Loco had lost a brother, one of the many young men who risked their lives on the streets of Jalisco to join the CJNG. This brother had been killed in a police operation months earlier, an operation that, according to rumors, had been organized directly by that wounded commander. El Loco's hatred for that man was profound, but there was also something more visceral. The commander, although an enemy, represented for him the last chance to prove his worth in the cartel. If he failed there, his position in the CJNG would be permanently compromised. While the cartel leader and his team awaited the order to advance, the tension inside the ambulance increased. Mariana, who until then had only been concerned about the commander's health, now realized that there was more at stake than she had imagined. The fate of that man was also her fate. If he died, she could be the next to pay the price. She looked at Marcos, who was beginning to sweat. He knew what was at stake, but his courage seemed to be waning as the net closed in. "Marcos," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the commander. "If he dies, what will we do?" Marcos didn't answer immediately. He knew that even if the commander survived, the problems would only be beginning. The CJNG wasn't known for leaving witnesses. They had cruel methods of dealing with anyone they considered a threat. But there was something else he also knew, something that would make him fight. He couldn't leave Mariana in those hands. No matter the cost, he would do whatever it took to protect her. Loyalty and the instinct for survival was stronger than any fear he felt. Outside, the siege was about to intensify. The CJNG men were in position, their weapons ready. One signal, a simple gesture from El Loco, and everything would turn into a battlefield. But what none of them knew was that the commander, even in his critical condition, possessed information that could reverse the course of the drug war in Mexico. The key to a crucial infiltration operation lay in his mind, and he was about to be the pivot of a turning point in the dangerous game between the cartels. The siege was about to intensify, and the choices made in the coming hours would define not only the fate of the commander, but of everyone involved. The sound of doors being forced open echoed across the deserted road, an immense and imminent threat. The pressure inside the ambulance was unbearable. Mariana looked at Marcos, who was desperately trying to find a way out. The commander, still unconscious, seemed to be the center of everything, but Marcos knew that the situation was no longer just about him. The lives of everyone there were at stake. It was then that the ambulance's side door finally gave way, and two masked men, armed to the teeth, stormed inside. The dim light of their flashlights reflected off the hard, impassive faces of the CJNG members. The tension that hung in the air was replaced by a glacial coldness. "Get up now!" shouted one of the men, pushing Marcos against the driver's seat. But before he could react, another man pointed the gun at Mariana's head. "The commander. He has to come with us," said the group leader. a man with a merciless gaze. "And you too, if you don't cooperate, you'll die here." Marcos swallowed hard. He knew the situation was increasingly out of control. The only thing he could do was try to buy time, but escape options were exhausted. He looked at Mariana, who was silent, her eyes fixed on the wounded commander. She said nothing, but her gaze made it clear that if he were captured, there was no way of knowing what would happen next. "Please," Mariana said, her voice breaking. "He's still alive. He can help you." El Loco, who was outside overseeing the operation, stepped forward. He looked directly at Mariana, analyzing every word, every movement. For a moment, it seemed he was hesitant. But what he didn't know, and what none of his men knew, was that the wounded commander possessed a key that could change everything. "You don't understand," Mariana continued, now more firmly. "He knows what you're looking for. If he dies now, everything will be lost." That sentence made El Loco stop. Something in Mariana's expression made him reconsider his decision. The wounded commander, whom he had sworn to destroy, could be the key to the cartel's victory or to their total destruction. It was risky, but the possibility of taking command of the drug war through the information he possessed made El Loco hesitate. For a brief moment he believed he could turn the tables, but what no one knew was that, while they were arguing and buying time, the commander was slowly recovering. He felt the cold of the environment, the smell of dust, and the muffled noises. Slowly, he began to open his eyes, trying to understand where he was and who was nearby. When he saw the man in front of him, a wave of recognition washed over him. El Loco, the man who had lost his brother, the man who was behind him. A faint smile appeared on the commander's face, but his eyes were clear, as if he had recovered in seconds. "You are still here?" the commander murmured in a hoarse voice. "Do you think you're going to catch me that easily?" El Loco froze, his eyes wide. The expression on the commander's face wasn't that of a weak or defeated man, but of someone who somehow had control over the situation. What nobody knew was that this commander possessed not only the information the CJNG sought, but also an ace up his sleeve that would change everything. The game was about to change, and at that moment both the cartel and the ambulance occupants realized that nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. The silence inside the ambulance was broken only by the sound of the commander breathing heavily, but steadily. The CJNG members, who had previously been so confident of their imminent victory, now seemed confused. El Loco, who was about to give the final order, looked at the commander with half-closed eyes, as if trying to find some sign of weakness in the man before him. But what he found was something far more dangerous. A deadly calm. "You think you caught me by surprise?" the commander spoke, his voice hoarse, but full of an authority that could not be ignored. "You and your men don't know who you're dealing with." The CJNG leader hesitated. For a moment he looked at his men, who were on alert but clearly uncomfortable with the situation. The wounded commander was still a formidable enemy, and his attitude now seemed more like a threat than a surrender. Marcos and Mariana exchanged glances, neither fully understanding what was happening. The commander, with pain and blood still coursing through his body, wasn't just resisting. He was playing the game with an intelligence they hadn't anticipated. She knew this meant the battle was far from over. On the contrary, it seemed the siege was beginning to shift direction. Marcos, still with the CJNG's pistol pointed at him, had no choice but to remain still. Any movement could result in his immediate death, but his mind was working quickly, calculating what to do next. "What are you going to do now?" the commander asked with a wry smile. "Are you going to kill me and lose the only chance to make a deal with whoever is behind all this?" El Loco didn't respond immediately. He knew the commander was referring to something much bigger. If he killed the man now, he would lose his only chance to exploit the information he possessed. The commander's words were beginning to make sense, and the fear of making a mistake was starting to creep into El Loco's heart. "Let us out," Mariana said suddenly, her voice trembling but firm. "You know what he knows. Let us out, and we'll bring the information to you." The cartel leader looked at her, hesitating. He didn't trust her at all, but what the commander had said was true. The information he had could turn the tide, but he couldn't appear weak in front of his men. He needed to maintain control. The seconds dragged on. The CJNG members watched, awaiting a decision. But then a new feeling overcame El Loco, a breaking point. He had to make a quick decision, but he also knew that any mistake could cost him and the cartel their lives. "Release the ambulance," he ordered, his tone harsher now. "But nobody leaves here until I get what I want." The cartel men, their tensions flaring, began to retreat, but not before leaving one last message. "If you lie, you won't live to tell the tale." The ambulance was released, and the sense of relief felt by Marcos and Mariana was palpable but fleeting. The commander, still weak, was kept under surveillance, while the fate of everyone there hung on a single piece of information that could now completely change the course of the drug war in Mexico. Marcos looked at Mariana and said in a tense voice, "We have a chance, but it's going to be risky. We need to get out of this situation before the CJNG realizes we still have an ace up our sleeve." The first few minutes after the ambulance was released felt like an eternity. The road ahead was still surrounded, but the momentary despair had given way to a sharp focus. Marcos looked out the window, and although the cartel's car lights still illuminated the darkness, he knew that escape wouldn't be easy. They had what they wanted, the information the commander possessed. But the CJNG wasn't the kind of organization that let its enemies get away unscathed. They would be followed, hunted to the end. But something in Mariana's gaze, something he hadn't noticed before, began to change. She, who had always been cautious, now seemed more determined. She had distanced herself somewhat from her impulsiveness and begun to think more clearly. The fear was still there, but it was now only a secondary force, overshadowed by the need to survive and protect those she cared about. "What are we going to do now?" Mariana asked, her voice calmer than before. She was adjusting to the situation, understanding that in moments like this there was no room for hesitation. Marcos thought for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel as his brain worked at full speed. He knew he needed to stay calm. They had been surrounded by one of the most ruthless cartels in the world, but the information the commander possessed was now an advantage. They were no longer just running. They were playing a game of chess with a much larger adversary. "We need to get the commander out of sight before they find out he's alive," Marcos said, his voice firmer than he felt. "I know what we're carrying, but we have no choice but to act fast. If they find out we still have a card, the hunt will be relentless." Odund, the commander, who had been silent until then, made a considerable effort to sit up. His expression was more somber, but there was a strength in the lines of his face that the others could not ignore. He knew that the CJNG, with all its brutality, would not hesitate to eliminate anyone considered a threat, but he also knew that the only way to get out of there alive was to use the information he possessed. "I know where you're going," the commander said, his voice still hoarse but authoritative, "and I know you won't leave this road without them knowing where we are. We have to be smarter." Marcos and Mariana exchanged glances. The commander was right. They couldn't rely solely on luck. Their only chance was to confuse their pursuers. "There's a way out, a secondary road, but it's risky," the commander continued, forcing himself to be more alert. "We'll go through an old checkpoint. If we're lucky, the police are still there. We can use that to our advantage." Mariana looked at him, feeling the weight of his words. She knew the road was full of pitfalls, but she also understood that they no longer had time to wait or hesitate. Marcos, now more determined than ever, turned the steering wheel and followed the direction indicated by the commander. The plan was simple, but daring. They needed to reach that checkpoint before the CJNG could reorganize. But more than ever he knew that survival was in each of their hands. Mariana, the commander, and he, all with a single objective, to escape alive and deliver the information to the authorities who could, perhaps, turn the tide in the war against the cartel. But as the vehicle moved forward, something became clear to Marcos. He, who had always been cautious, now found himself in a position where courage was not only necessary, it was crucial. He felt that despite the fear and confusion, he had transformed. He was no longer the driver who hoped to escape unscathed. He was stronger, more prepared to face what was to come. Mariana also felt the transformation. With each passing second, she felt her confidence grow. She was no longer just trying to save a life. She was becoming part of a larger fight where her actions could truly make a difference. She would no longer be just a spectator. She was an active participant in a game far more dangerous than she had imagined. And the commander, even wounded, was recovering, not only physically, but mentally. He knew that the key to everyone's survival was in his hands. He, who had once been the target, was now becoming the strategist. His role had changed, and he knew that with the information he possessed, he could finally make the final move. The back road was dark and full of treacherous curves, but despite the imminent danger, the sense of urgency grew with each kilometer traveled. The adrenaline coursing through Marcos's veins was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Every decision, every second seemed like a step closer to the end, but at the same time, he knew there was no turning back. It was all or nothing. Mariana was silent, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew they were approaching something that could change everything. The commander, though wounded, seemed more alert than ever, his mind racing. He, who until that moment had been a burden and a responsibility, was now the key to everyone's survival. His information might be their only chance of escaping alive, but how far could he trust the cartel? And more importantly, how far was the commander willing to go to ensure everyone got out unharmed? "The checkpoint is just ahead," the commander said, his voice still low but firmer than in the last few hours. "If we're right, the CJNG won't see us coming, but if we don't act quickly, they'll catch us before we even get across." Marcos nodded, the tension visible in his expression. He knew time was running out, and any mistake could mean the end of everything. "And what else can we do?" he asked, almost as if the answer were beyond his reach. He no longer knew what was at stake. It wasn't just the escape, it was the fight for something much bigger. Mariana, still processing everything that was happening, looked at the commander. "Are you sure this is the only chance? Isn't there another way out?" The commander looked at her with an expression that was both weary and filled with bitter wisdom. "There is no other choice. If we stay here, we will die. The CJNG will destroy us, and what remains of the war will continue. But if we manage to reach the control point, we have a chance, and that chance won't last long." The tension increased with each passing second. With every turn of the steering wheel, Marcos felt as if he were driving straight into the unknown. He was about to enter a territory where nothing made sense anymore. The road, which had previously seemed like a possible escape, now transformed into the thin line between life and death. As the car moved forward, the commander began instructing Marcos on what he would need to do as they approached the checkpoint. It was a daring and dangerous plan. They needed to infiltrate quickly, take advantage of the confusion and possible support from the authorities still on site, and, if all went well, break through the CJNG encirclement. But of course, there was an immense risk. If they failed, there would be no one left to save. Mariana, who until then had focused on ensuring the commander remained stable, was now also preparing for what was to come. She looked at Marcos, and for a brief moment, their hands met on the steering wheel. There were no words, only a silent understanding between them. They were in this together. The future was completely uncertain, but at that moment, the only thing that mattered was survival. The sound of the engines echoed in the darkness, like a harbinger of what was to come. The checkpoint was drawing ever closer, and as they approached, Marcos felt the weight of the decision. He knew that after crossing that point, nothing would ever be the same again. The pieces of the game were about to move, and more than ever, he felt the urgency to act. But he wasn't the only one feeling the pressure. The commander, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, knew the net was closing in. He could no longer pretend everything was under control. The CJNG, which until then had seemed an unbeatable force, was about to discover what it meant to be pitted against an enemy who also knew how to play dirty. He had a card that could turn the tide, and now was the time to play it. The road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, each curve revealing more darkness and more danger. The checkpoint was now less than 3 kilometers away. Marcos glanced in the rearview mirror once more. The CJNG was rapidly approaching. He could see the cartel's car lights reflecting on the road, like predators stalking their prey. "We're almost there," the commander said with tense calm, his eyes fixed on the road. "When we arrive, you'll have to act fast. The police can help us, but we don't know if they're in control or if they're somehow compromised." Marcos nodded, sweat trickling down his forehead. The car was moving forward, but the tension in the air seemed too heavy to ignore. They were about to face the most ruthless enemy of all, and everything depended on how quickly they made a decision. Mariana silently watched the rearview mirror. Her heart was racing, but she couldn't afford to falter. She knew her chances were dwindling with each passing second, but the only thing she could do was trust Marcos, trust the commander. The road ahead was empty, but in the distance, a figure stood out. The checkpoint was in sight. Marcos accelerated, and the tires screeched against the asphalt, pushing the car at a frightening speed. He knew that at any moment the CJNG's encirclement could close in, but the checkpoint was closer than ever. He couldn't stop now. "They saw us," said Mariana, her voice trembling, pointing to the mirrors. "They already know where we are." Marcos clenched his teeth. The plan needed to be executed now. Without further hesitation, he swerved abruptly toward the checkpoint entrance, causing the car to skid. The ambulance sped through, passing barricades and road signs, until it reached the checkpoint. At the checkpoint, an armed police officer appeared ahead. He looked at the vehicle suspiciously, but upon recognizing the license plate, hesitated. Before the officer could speak, Marcos jumped out of the car, his hand raised, signaling for the situation to be resolved quickly. "We're allies," Marcos shouted. "The CJNG is after us. We have vital information for you." The policeman glanced back at the car, the other officers closing in. The tension in the air was palpable. They knew something big was happening, but what? The commander, still in his weakened condition, made a monumental effort to get out of the vehicle. His presence seemed like a death sentence. "He's the one you need," the commander spoke, his voice still weak but full of authority. "They'll kill us if they find out we're here. We know where the CJNG will attack next week, where the next trucks loaded with drugs will pass." The police officers, who had previously been hesitant, began to realize the gravity of the situation. The commander wasn't just wounded. He was the key to an operation that could dismantle one of the country's largest drug trafficking networks. "Quick!" one of the policemen shouted. "Pick that up! Let's go inside!" But before the commander could be taken to safety, a series of shots rang out from outside. The CJNG was closer than they had imagined. Marcos turned, running inside the station with Mariana, pulling the commander with him. The checkpoint gates were quickly shut, and the police began to form a defensive line. But the CJNG didn't care about barriers. They had arrived in full force. El Loco was there. He had been following closely, and now he was prepared to eliminate anyone who stood in the way of his objective. His face was tense, his eyes fixed on the entrance to the checkpoint. But he didn't expect what happened next. The police officers, armed to the teeth and ready to face any threat, began firing. El Loco shouted orders to his men, and the battle erupted in seconds. The sound of gunfire was deafening, but amidst the chaos, one figure stood out. The commander, though wounded, was once again in command. He was no longer a prisoner, he was the leader. With a swift and unexpected movement, he activated a security device hidden in his jacket, sending a message to a secret police task force, which quickly positioned itself around the outpost, preparing to dismantle the CJNG operation. But El Loco, seeing that the situation was slipping out of his hands, made one last move. With a cry of rage, he lunged forward, but the response was immediate. A well-aimed shot, fired by one of the policemen, struck him directly in the chest. The chaos intensified. The CJNG was being defeated, but the battle was not yet over. While the commander was being taken to safety, the remaining cartel members fought for survival, but the forces were evenly matched. Marcos and Mariana, now out of the cartel's immediate reach, breathed a sigh of relief, but they knew the worst was yet to come. The war against the cartel continued, but they had won a crucial battle. The dust began to settle after the battle at the checkpoint. The sound of gunfire had ceased, but the echo of the fight still resonated in the minds of all those present. Marcos and Mariana were finally out of the CJNG's reach. But what had happened there? The war, the betrayal, the sacrifice could not be erased so easily. Life, in some way, went on, but it was impossible to ignore the cost of victory. Marcos looked at Mariana as they walked out of the checkpoint. The tension on their faces was still visible, but there was also a profound relief. They had succeeded. Not only had they survived, but they had also stopped the cartel's advance, at least for now. The commander, now safe, was with the police, being escorted to a secure location. He knew his fight was far from over, but the weight of his decisions was finally being recognized. He was no longer a prisoner of the CJNG, but a man who, though wounded, still had the power to change the course of events. Mariana, standing beside Marcos, took a deep breath. She had changed during this journey, not only as a person, but as someone who understood the true importance of courage and decisiveness. There was no more room for doubt. She knew that the fight against evil was constant, and that despite her fears, she had become a force to be reckoned with. "Do you think this is over?" Marcos asked, looking at Mariana. His voice was softer now, but the question still hung in the air. Mariana looked at him with a tired but resolute expression. "No, it's not over. But today we won a battle, and for now that's enough." The commander, in his weakened state, was being treated by doctors, but his eyes still held the strength of someone who knew his mission was not over. He looked at Marcos and Mariana with a small smile. "You did it, even though you didn't believe you could. Now, what comes next is just the beginning. The CJNG may have lost today, but the war isn't over. They will return, and we will have to be ready." Silence fell for a moment. Everyone knew that despite the victory, the fight against the cartel was a marathon, not a sprint. But at that instant there was a feeling of relief, a sense that they had done the right thing, that their actions had marked a turning point. Marcos looked at the road ahead. The light of dawn was beginning to creep along the horizon. They had conquered that night, but the day was yet to come. What the future held, no one knew, but at least in that moment there was hope. The war against evil, against the CJNG, would continue, but something had changed in that battle. They had shown that even in the face of the most immense adversity, there was room for resistance, their resistance, and however long the fight might still be, they were ready to face it together. Months had passed since the confrontation at the checkpoint. The war against the CJNG hadn't diminished, but Marcos and Mariana had become key figures in a new resistance, working tirelessly to eradicate the cartel. The commander, now out of danger, remained a crucial piece in the strategy, but each day the tension grew. The CJNG remained silent, but Marcos knew the worst was yet to come. The only certainty was that the battle wouldn't end until the evil was completely eradicated, and while the future was uncertain, their fight was stronger than ever.